All right, guys, I'm standing right here in a beautiful overlook. This is Mount Sniffles in front of me. It's a beautiful sunrise and the color is happening. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a few shots and tell you exactly what I'm doing in a second. All right, so at this point, we're about 3 minutes away from the sunrise. And as you can see, there are a couple of clouds overhanging the peak. And I'm hoping that they're going to be lit up from underneath. And right after that, we should be getting some color on the top of the mountain. So that's supposed to be spectacular. Unfortunately, it's not the right time of the year to be here just because these aspens in front of me, they're all green. But in the fall, in about a month actually away from this point of time, all of these aspens are supposed to be glowing in color and it's going to be spectacular. But at the same time, every once in a while you do get some snow on the top of the peaks, and when that happens, that pink that gets reflected from the clouds back to the snow can create these beautiful images that just look spectacular. All right, we're about 15 minutes past sunrise, and what I want to do now is go through my camera settings, my framing composition, and a few other things that I had to consider as I was taking the shot. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is focusing. At this point, since I'm standing at an overlook, I really don't have to worry about any foreground elements. In fact, my composition and framing excludes everything here in the foreground. So my hyperfocal distance is going to be infinity, and that's something that actually I don't have to even worry about, because if I zoom in to the distance and just focus on any object in the distance, everything is going to be sharp. So from that standpoint, my focusing was relatively easy. All I had to do was zoom in, and then I used manual focusing because earlier there wasn't enough light for me to use autofocus or rely on autofocus. And once I zoomed in and tweaked the focus, I could see that everything was turning out very sharp. Now with this combination, which is the Sony mirrorless camera with the 2470 GM 2.8 lens, I know that this lens is very sharp at its f5.6 aperture. So I went ahead and set that to that aperture, and then after I took the shot, I examined it, corner to corner, it looked very sharp. Once I set my focusing, the next step was to make sure that my framing and composition are set right. Now, the mountain here is obviously the most prominent element in the scene, so that's my primary subject. And what I did was I placed it in the middle of the frame so it's center composition. That also gives me balance. Now, I also went for simplicity. I did not want to include anything in the foreground, so I zoomed in a little bit tighter and included more of the scene over there than anything here in the foreground. So that's also important to point out. Also, there's a very small grove of trees on the bottom right side of the frame that I wanted to make sure that I incorporate into the scene without cutting into them. So as I was working with my framing, I had to zoom in just a little bit more, but not too much into the scene so that I don't cut into that on that lower right side of the frame. Now, in terms of exposure, when I started earlier, it was obviously much darker, so I had to go with slow shutter speed. But as the sunrise started taking place and I started getting a little bit of light on that peak of the mountain, I had to work with exposure quite a bit. And my challenge was that this valley right here in front of me was so much darker than the sky. And in that situation, what I would normally do is use a filter. But in this case, since I don't have a filter, my second solution would be to resort to something like an HDR or a blending technique. And in that situation, what I would do is take a picture that is going to be slightly darker than a standard, which would be a normally exposed shot, and then slightly overexposed shot. In an overexposed shot, what I'm doing is blowing out the sky, but I have enough detail in the foreground so that when I blend the three together, I can have the least amount of noise and the highest quality image possible with retaining all the highlight detail in the shot. It's important to point out that it might not be the ideal time of the year to be here, simply because the aspens haven't changed color yet. But the reason why I'm here is because I wanted to highlight two things. One is to demonstrate how to do HDR, and two, to highlight the importance of scouting. Now, I'm standing here, I know that my framing works, I know that composition looks really good, and with the primary subject in my scene, I know I can take a very appealing photo if the conditions are right. So knowing this, all I have to do is come back to this exact same spot and take another shot when the conditions are right. Now, take a look at some of these images. These are the ones that I took over the years, and you can see how spectacular this location can get. One great thing about landscape photography is that once you have a spot that you really like, you can come back to the same spot over and over again. And once you have your framing and composition set, like in this scene right here, as you can see, I've captured so many great images over the years. And for me, that just doesn't get tiring. So let's go ahead and take these images into post-processing and see what we can do with them. I have a total of 6 images loaded into my Lightroom catalog. That means I have 2 sequences of HDR images to choose from. So let's jump right into it. I've got this image and this image as my reference files. So let's take a look at which one is going to be better. Now, this one I really like. There's a little bit of subtle color on the face of the mountain as well as over here, and then the cloud is kind of going as a line beautifully. In this one, it's a little bit brighter. I've got a ton more kind of light here on the top of the mountain, but then the cloud is just not working out very well. This is shot a little bit later in the day. So I think I'm gonna start with this sequence. So let's take a look at what we got here. If I'm gonna work on these 3 images, I'm just going to go ahead and mark them as 5 stars. I've got the overexposed image, standard, and then underexposed image right here. And those are perfect candidates for an HDR. So go ahead and right click, Photo Merge HDR. I've got both auto align and auto tone turned off because if I turn auto tone in this particular image, it's making it look really weird. So I'm just gonna click merge without that. And Lightroom has just created a DNG file. So this is the one that I'm gonna be editing. Now, one thing to keep in mind, you might notice that the colors between these 3 images is completely different. The colors are different, and the reason why is because this was shot in auto white balance. If you're shooting HDR in auto white balance, your camera might go into these different white balance settings between the shots, and that's what happened on the Sony camera here. But it doesn't really matter because I shot in RAW, so at the end of the day, it's all going to be the same in one DNG file anyway. So let's go ahead and work on a couple of things. Now in this image, I'm going to do a few things. First of all, I'm going to crop it. I didn't really notice that I had a piece of leaf here on the top or in the bottom left side of the frame, and I have this bush that I don't want in the frame. So I'm going to first start out by doing a little bit of cropping. I'm gonna make sure that I have that locked just so that we can preserve the aspect ratio. So I'm just going to push it up right on the edge of that tree line. Now I don't want to be pushing it too far, but enough to get rid of that leaf right there. And maybe I'm gonna clean that piece a little bit later on if that bothers me. Other than that, I think it looks pretty good right there. And I'm not going to worry about cropping anything from the top. So that's a pretty good way to start things out. I'm going to scroll down here, camera standard, push my saturation maybe by, let's see, for this image, maybe something like 20 would be good. I've got a little bit of color here, but obviously the leaves haven't turned yet, so it's a little bit early in the season. Let's go ahead and turn profile corrections and just do very, very quick edits here. Just set the sharpening to something like 40 and a little bit of masking right around there. I've got most of the image ready. Now I need to work on these highlights. So because it's an HDR image, obviously there are going to be some things that we need to adjust, and specifically when it comes to highlights. Usually with HDR images, you're gonna have to go somewhere extreme like -90 or -100 just to be able to recover all that detail. And then the shadows, they're already kind of boosted up. So in fact, if I'm gonna start adjusting that, it's going to look pretty bad. And that's one thing about HDR that I don't like. Sometimes you have to work with these weird settings, and adjusting that to +30 makes it super bright. So now is the time to tone down on the exposure. So maybe 0.35 or so would be ideal. And I'm actually going to bring shadows down to something like 10. And in this case, you know what? I've recovered so much here. It's actually looking pretty good right there. So let's work with the whites. Bring that out just a tad. And then blacks down furthermore. And let's see, -15 or so. I think that's looking pretty good. The image itself overall looks a little bit too dark though at this stage. So I'm going to go -15 instead of -35. And then this side of the sky, it looks overexposed. So I'm just going to make a quick fix. Just dial maybe something like 0.75. I know that sounds a bit extreme, but it is very bright in here. So we're gonna have to work with that. Turn it over just like that. And I also don't like that this is kind of too light compared to these areas here. So maybe I'm gonna try to go -1. No, that's a bit too much. So minus 0.85 maybe. Minus 0.85. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce or change my temperature to make it a little bit more blue. By doing that, as you can see, I'm actually adjusting that color of the sky to make it a little bit more blue. So gotta be careful about how much I pull it, because if I go too much, it's gonna start making weird transitions over here. In fact, that's what I'm already seeing. So I'm gonna go ahead and go into brush, erase, turn on the mask overlay, and let's just start painting this area out so it doesn't touch it. So let's just see how that's gonna work. Well, that's a bit too extreme. And start painting some of this area out. Now, what I wanna do is I wanna make sure that it's not going to be 100% or even 80% flow. So let's turn it down quite a bit and just very subtle change right here, just so that it doesn't kill everything. Just very small change over here. All right, let's take a look. I think that's looking a little bit better. Maybe that was a bit too much. So I'm just going to push it over to this area as well, just a little bit. All right, so I think that's looking much better now, much better transition. Let's go ahead and close that tool. And I'm pretty happy with the way that the sky looks so far. And if I need to make any other adjustments, I can do that in Photoshop later. But so far for Lightroom, I think that's looking pretty good. So even though the sky is looking fairly decent right now, there's still quite a bit of work. And as you can see, this area right here looks very green. So this image needs a lot of work at this point. And the very first thing that I need to work on is the white balance, because the white balance is completely messed up. In fact, with HDR images, that's kind of what you're gonna end up with in many cases when the blending happens. Sometimes you'll end up with lots of funky colors. So in this case, I need to work with the greens, and there's just so much stuff going on in here with the tint. So I'm going to go ahead and push this to the right and see if we can hopefully reduce some of that crazy greenery happening. So right around +20, +21, I think it's getting much better. Let's take a look at the before and after. As you can see now, the greens are slightly better. Still, I don't like how green it looks, so I'm gonna have to work with the HSL sliders in a little bit. But a couple of things that I wanted to add in here. I'll probably darken this area just a bit and then also work on the sky a little bit more. So let's go ahead and drop a gradient in the sky. And this time I'm going to set the exposure to 0 and just bring it down right in the center. Right around here. Maybe increase the size just a little bit for better transition. And this time I'm going to play with the highlights a little bit. Reduce them just a little bit more. There we go. And then also the temperature. I think by working on the tint and making it a little bit too on the right, making it too magenta, I also made the sky a little bit too magenta. So I'm gonna bring that back a little bit and see if I can reduce that. So maybe right around -7, -10. You know what, I'm just going to go, yeah, somewhere around -8. And now let's go ahead and actually even reduce the exposure a little bit. So I'll just dial 0.2 and that should look pretty good. All right, and then the next step is to do kind of the same thing on the bottom here. I think it's just too bright and then the greens are not looking good. So once again, that's something I'm gonna have to work on, and I'm going to push this up now and maybe right around here, and let's bring down the exposure by maybe half a stop. Well, that's too much, maybe 0.3, right around there. Okay, I think that's looking much better now. Okay, so now I'm gonna have to deal with all the color craziness. Now, the last thing I wanna do is add any more color, so I'm not going to mess with vibrance or saturation. So let's just scroll down here to HSL. because this image desperately needs a lot of attention right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the greens and especially the saturation here. And I want to tone down on the saturation. Look at the greens here in the distance and then the greens over here. There's a mix of aspen, cottonwood, and then evergreen here, and more aspen here in the background, more evergreen here in the distance. So it's just a very difficult image to shoot in this time of the year. There's a reason why I come back to the spot in the fall, because the colors look spectacular. But in this particular case, we are demonstrating HDR and blending techniques. So for that reason, I do want to do a little bit of editing and make this look as good as possible. So I'm going to tone down the greens over here, maybe desaturate the yellows and the greens a little bit, and that looks a little bit better. Maybe that's a bit too much. And then the same thing over here, just tone them down, and that looks like it's just a mixture of aqua and blue, which is, you know, given the distance, that's kind of something that makes sense. And then over here as well, very, very bright greens that I'm gonna reduce just a tad more. So it's desaturating the entire green area that's resulting in a little bit of better color, in my opinion. And in this case, let's play with the luminance a little bit and maybe bring some of the colors out. So I'm going to go with in luminance, and let's see what we can do here. All right, I can increase maybe the greens a little bit, just the luminance in that area, and then maybe work with the yellows just a tad to bring them out and make them slightly brighter so that they can stand out just a little bit. There we go. And I think that's for Lightroom edit, that's actually not looking too bad given the circumstances, obviously. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take it as is into Photoshop and see if I can make the image look a little bit better. Now that the image is open in Photoshop, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tools that you're already familiar with. So I'm going to go ahead and fire up Nik software, and I'm going to start with a Color Effects Pro just to see what I can do with that green environment, and obviously trying to boost the contrast just a tad so that the image looks better. So I've got Pro Contrast in front of me right now. Let's go ahead and work with the dynamic contrast setting first. And as you can see, as I move it to the right, it's brightening up the foreground. So I don't want to go too aggressive on it, but maybe bring it up just a tad, right around somewhere 20. And then the correct contrast, as you can see, as I start doing that, it's affecting more of the mid-tones, maybe just a little bit of the shadows too. So I'll just keep it somewhere around 9 or so. And then the color cast in this situation is probably not going to work. As you can see, it's actually screwing up my sky quite a bit, so I'm not going to touch that setting at all. Add filter, and I'm hoping that the polarization filter is going to enhance the sky a little bit more. So as I push it to the right, you can see that it is in fact making the sky look much better. The only thing that I'm not happy with is it's adding blue here on the mountain left side and over here as well. If I go back, you can see that setting affecting the haze in the distance, but it's okay because I can also use Viveza and go to that area, darken it a little bit and boost its contrast, and maybe even desaturate it a little bit to get rid of that. So I think I'm happy with these with this polarization setting right around maybe somewhere around 85 or so. All right, so let's go ahead and click OK. And it's going to go ahead and save everything that I've done so far. And that's our before and after. And that's a pretty drastic change in the way that the image appears. I like the way that now these trees are more or less separating from this grass area here. It's still a little bit too green, so I'm gonna have to work on that a little bit in a later point of time. But I don't like also the way that the sky appears here. It's just a bit too bland for my taste, a little bit white over here, and then just not enough blue. And then I want to add a little bit of more color in the sky. But the first thing I want to do before I go there is I want to fix up some of these areas. So I'm gonna fire up Viveza and go ahead and maximize that. And let's go ahead and first of all, this area is a little bit too bright for my taste, And then also this line of aspen trees in the distance has some funky green color, and then the blue that I just added over here is not looking good. So let's start over here by reducing that haze. So remember, reducing the brightness can help significantly. So I'm just gonna push it to something like maybe -6, and then increase the contrast just a little bit to something like maybe 15. Right there, that's looking pretty good. In fact, I'm actually going to reduce the brightness furthermore, maybe to something like -8. And I'm going to duplicate that, and let's just move it over here. And actually, this is a good time right now to reduce some of that blue. So I'm just going to mess with this blue slider here and maybe set it to something like -15 in blue. And I think that's going to do a fairly good job with getting rid of a lot of that blue. So I'm going to do the same thing for that pointer, and definitely -15. Let's get rid of that 0. There we go. All right, I'm going to just duplicate that and move it over here, somewhere around here, and duplicate it and apply it over here. As you can see, that is helping significantly in reducing that blue in the mountain there. So just bring it over here as well. And lastly, I think it would be a good idea to put it over here. There we go. All right, so let's take a look at the before and after, and that's what we've got so far. I think that's looking pretty good. It is also affecting this tree line over here, so I have to be very careful about how I apply that. So I just need to probably just click the add control point and just paste it over here so that it's not touching this area right here. So let's just increase that a little bit and then duplicate so that the green is not touched by that setting, and it's staying separate. A little bit more work than usual, but that's okay. So maybe, oh yeah, it is definitely affecting that area too. So that's okay. I'm going to actually do the same thing over here. I'm just going to start a new one and then concentrate on those greens, reduce the brightness. So let's just reduce it to a little bit, maybe -10. And then this time I'm actually going to work with the greens as well, because I don't like the way those greens look. So if I go too much to the left, they almost become too dark like evergreen. And if I push to the right, as you can see, that's just not looking good. So I'm gonna tone it down to something like -10. And then the same thing, I think it also has quite a bit of blue, in fact. Yep, it does. So let's just push it to a little bit more extreme, like -20. All right, so I think that's looking pretty good, and I'm going to now duplicate that. And it's a pretty complex edit when it comes to these kind of changes, but unfortunately, that's just the way that some of the images are going to be. So before and after, that's the way it's looking right now. I think it's a much more toned down look, looking much better in my opinion, and the greens are looking more natural. So let's go ahead and click OK. Next, let's fix the sky. So I'm going to bring up Viveza one more time. And what I want to do is work on some of the brightness stuff in here, and also hopefully make it a little bit bluer so that it's not looking too bad. So I'm going to reduce the brightness just a tad, maybe something like -8 or so. And then let's add a little bit of blue, just a tad. That's too much. Maybe even a little bit of saturation, which is going to be kind of in combination with the two, should hopefully result in a little bit better looking sky. And then over here, I've got this area that's a little bit dark, which is a bit weird compared to this white area over here. So I'm just going to fix its brightness first. Maybe just something like +4 brightness. I think that's looking a little bit better. And I'm going to click OK. And let's take a look at the before and after. And as you can see, that right side is pretty significantly different compared to what I had before. It did add a little bit of a blue over here, but you know, to be honest, it's really not that big of a deal. If I wanted to fix it, I would probably use the masking tool to try to get rid of that. But I think it looks fairly good. And I could also add a little bit of color to the sky over here, but I'm not going to bother with it. I think so far the image looks much better than what I had before. Let's take a look. I'm gonna go ahead and merge everything that I've done so far to the image so that we have the Color Effects Pro and then the image that we started with. So this is our starting point from Lightroom, and this is where we're at right now in Photoshop. As you can see, it's a pretty big difference. Let me go ahead and zoom in just one, and you can see that there is a very big difference, especially over here in these areas, and the colors actually look much better in my opinion now with the added contrast. And as a last step, I'm going to go ahead and go to Image Contrast just to see how much more contrast I can get. And I knew that the image was a bit too dark, so by adding a little bit of contrast, it makes it far brighter. But to be honest, looking between these two, this one is a bit too much for my taste. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and simply duplicate the layer, Command J, and then I'm going to apply that same contrast on this new layer, and then I'm just going to tone it down. So let's just bring it down to something like 50%. So let's take a look. I think that is looking much better. It's a little bit brighter, not as bright as Photoshop suggested, but I like this brighter version better. So this is the before and after. Let's go ahead and now save this image, and I'm going to merge everything into one layer because I really don't need to go back and make any more changes to the image. So go ahead and save the image, and we can go back to Lightroom and now take a look at the before and after. Now that we have all the changes saved, let's take a look at the earlier DNG file. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the beginning on import, and this is the way that the image looked when the merge HDR merge completed. And now it's a good time to take a look at the two images and see what we've done so far with the image. And as you can see, the difference is huge. We've done a ton in terms of the way that the image appears. I really don't like all these greens in here. It's just not looking good at all. And in this image, it's more or less looking better. I could still tone down on the greens over here if I wanted to, but I think it looks fairly decent. By now, you should know quite a bit about doing HDR, but there's one technique that I haven't discussed yet, which I think can be very useful in some situations, and that's exposure blending. Now, why would you want to do exposure blending versus HDR? Well, in this case, as you've seen, despite my attempts, the image just came out too green, and in some situations, you'll end up with so much saturation in your images that HDR images can be very difficult to work with. In some cases, it might be just easier to blend images, and the blending technique simply means that you're taking two images, putting them literally on top of each other, and then taking one part of the image and pasting into another. And that can be done rather quickly in Photoshop in many ways, but one of the ways is going to be using Luminosity Masks. So I'm going to be demonstrating this technique next. Let me go ahead and close out of this image because we no longer need it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a Lightroom now and select kind of target image that I want to work with. So in this case, I've got two candidates. I've got this image right here, which has dark foreground, but then good exposure on the sky. And then I've got another image where the foreground is very bright, but then the sky is blown out. So the goal would be to take better parts of both images and combine them into a single image. Let me go ahead and select both. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the sky from this shot and then the foreground from this shot. It just looks way too bright. I'm not going to do any crazy editing here. All I want to do is just demonstrate you what you can do in Photoshop with the Luminosity Masks. So this sky is blown out, especially this part, and that's why I want to do it. And then in this image, the sky looks good. Let me just quickly reduce the exposure just a tad so that we have more of that sky, and maybe reduce the highlights just a little bit. Okay, that's looking pretty good. All right, so what I'm going to do now is right click on both images and go to Edit In, Open as Layers in Photoshop. Now that both images are loaded in Photoshop, you can see that I've got two layers. One layer contains that dark foreground and good sky, and the second one contains blown out sky and good foreground. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to swap these out because I'm going to be working off of this one. That's the sky that I want. And the idea here is to create a mask that is going to be smooth enough that when I apply the mask on the top layer, it's going to make that transition very nice and hopefully blend the image in a good way
that makes the image then totally blend and look nice. So what I'm gonna do is select my, click on my command, go into channels here, and then click on RGB. Now when I do that, as you can see, there is a selection. What it's doing is it's taking the brightest part of the image and applying a selection to that brightest part of the image. So if I go to layers now, with that selection, if I click on the mask tool and add that mask, look at what just happened. Let me just show you what just happened. I'm going to go one step back and add the layer mask. You can see that the sky just got completely replaced. In fact, this is what I was dealing with before. This is the sky that I had before, and now this is the sky that I have with this new image. So this is now the luminosity mask, and the power of the luminosity mask can be very visible when you hold on the option button and click on it, because that just reveals the luminosity mask. You can see this is what Photoshop did. It selected mostly the brightest area, but then there were some other parts of the image that also had some brightness in it. So for that reason, that bottom selection also contains some of that brightness. And by just using something like the brush tool and switching to a black, I can start completely erasing all of that area. And as you can see, in fact, if I change my opacity to 100%, if I do this, then I'm telling Photoshop, do not include anything from this image in my mask. And let's now click here. And as you can see, this is pretty much fully, look at the foreground. That's exactly the foreground that I had, whereas the sky has been taken mostly from that image. Now, while the sky here, if I look at the mask one more time and option click it, you can see that there are some darker areas in the clouds as well, which is why it's not a full blend. When I click on it, it's showing parts of the sky from this image and parts of the sky from this image. So in such situations, you can fine-tune your luminosity mask. In fact, there are so many different techniques working with luminosity masks that you can create your custom ones, or you can even use third-party plugins that allow you to create fine-tuned selections that only grab maybe midtones or only grab the very lights or the very darks in your image. So using those luminosity techniques, you can create beautiful blended images that would look even better potentially than HDR images. Now my goal here is not to do a full edit, because I've already done that with my HDR image, but you have a pretty good idea now looking at luminosity masks on how you can combine images using these different blending techniques. So if you're not satisfied with the HDR, by all means try the luminosity masks and the blending techniques within Photoshop. Those are very powerful. In fact, for landscape photography, many photographers, including myself, often use blending techniques in situations where you cannot or do not want to use HDR.